So, to the surprise of a lot of people, Daniel Dubois has just knocked out Anthony Joshua in round 5 in front of 96,000 fans at Wembley Stadium. The same Daniel Dubois who got stopped and took a knee against Joe Joyce and did the same against Oleksandr Usyk now has a case for being the #1 heavyweight in the world. But why has that happened? So let's start by talking about the fight itself. From the very moment the first bell rang, Dubois gives Joshua no space whatsoever. He dropped Joshua with a ridiculous right hand at the end of round 1 and then proceeded to just throw hands at Joshua for the rest of the fight. Joshua would offer surprisingly low resistance for the entire fight, basically spending most of it with his back to the ropes, getting dropped again in round 3, but then having a moment in round 5 who really hurt Dubois with a big right hand. Went for the finish, but then got caught in the process. So now the entire heavyweight picture has changed. Fights like Fury versus Joshua or Joshua Usyk 3 are now no longer possible or very unlikely to happen. Now this wasn't a crazy upset like Teofimo losing to Kambosos or Joshua's first loss to Andy Ruiz, but it was still quite a big upset, and I can't sit here and pretend like I didn't make a whole video explaining how Joshua destroys Dubois. But in hindsight, the result of the fight is very explainable. Dubois spent the first few years of his career as a prospect under Queensberry Promotions, putting on explosive fights, devastating knockouts, just exciting performances in general. So people started to think maybe he's the future of the heavyweight division because of his explosiveness, his power, his athleticism, and his just willingness to throw bombs at every opponent that he faces. His matchmaking for a prospect was very typical, mostly being matched up against journeymen, with the exception of Nathan Gorman, who's also a British undefeated heavyweight. Well, his first real competitive fight would be against Joe Joyce in 2020. Not only was this the first time we'd see Dubois against a live opponent, this was also the first time we'd see Dubois' autism on full display in the build-up to the fight.
You're gonna be sleeping, Joe.
Yeah, maybe I'll sleep for a split second, get up and then knock you there out.
When you wake back up, go on.
Huh?
No. Anyway, I'm gonna win, and I'm gonna win in devastating fashion, and it's gonna be a great night of boxing.
Did you bring that sleeping bag? Because you'll put me to sleep.
And then Dubois saying this to Joe Joyce's mum, who for context is blind.
Oh my dear, you know what? I'm gonna do you a favour, because you can't see your son after he's been knocked out. You'll spare the heartache. You'll be spared the heartache.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, aren't you nice?
Anyway, the fight happened, and from the very start of round 1, Joe Joyce kept jabbing Dubois straight in the face for almost the entire fight. Dubois did have his moments, landed the occasional big right hand, but the jab of Joyce kept landing over and over again until eventually Dubois' eyes swelled completely shut and he couldn't continue anymore. This meant that Dubois' momentum as a prospect had basically been completely derailed, especially considering that he was expected to beat Joe Joyce in this fight, but couldn't pass the test, which then naturally led to people making fun of him on social media. I think in hindsight what this fight was basically just a step too far for Daniel Dubois at that stage of his career. Because not only was Daniel Dubois only 23 years old at the time of the fight, Joe Joyce as an opponent is just a nightmare for someone's first step up. Not just because of the extensive amateur experience of Joe Joyce, but also because of the style of Joe Joyce as an opponent, because of his stamina, his chin, and the fact that Dubois is used to knocking over opponents in the first 2 rounds. So when Joe Joyce didn't even react to a lot of the punches Dubois was landing on him, that was a big wake-up call for Dubois. So it was back to the drawing board for Dubois, who would then take 3 relatively easy matchups before finally being back on the main stage at the end of 2022 against Kevin Lerena on the Fury Chisora 3 undercard. And it was a bit of a weird one. Dubois would take a couple punches at the start of round 1 and then go down as a result of it, but then he'd also take a knee twice in the same round, despite not taking any punches. So people assumed that either Dubois had never recovered from that first knockdown, or Dubois was injured. But if you look at it in slow motion, Lerena actually never lands a punch on Dubois in the first knockdown. So I believe that it was a leg injury that caused Dubois to go down 3 times. But regardless, Dubois would drop him in round 3 and then force the referee to stop the fight at the end of the round. So this was actually quite an impressive display of courage from Daniel Dubois, opposite to the idea of him being a quitter, which is what people thought of him at the time. This would then somehow land Dubois a fight with the current heavyweight king and pound-for-pound #1, Oleksandr Usyk. Dubois made a decent account of himself in the fight, but the only moment people really seem to talk about is the infamous low blow. Now, everyone seems to have their own different opinion about this one. If you want my opinion, I think Usyk definitely did milk it a bit because it wasn't fully on the balls, but it wasn't a clear body shot either. Usyk took it as an opportunity to take some time out. Now, whether Usyk could have got up if the ref didn't call it as a low blow is a completely different question, and we don't know the answer to it. But the overall better boxer clearly was Usyk, who won almost every round and then went on to drop Dubois twice, making him take a knee in round 9 and then stopping the fight. So Dubois' stock actually did go up for a lot of people after that fight, just because some people believe that the low blow counts as a knockout for Dubois, so they see him as the unified champion. Also to do with the fact that no one really expected Dubois to even win a round of the fight, so to see him do well for himself surprised a lot of people. Following the Usyk fight, Saudi Arabia would then start to make their impact in boxing by putting on these mega cards every month, and the second of which would be in December of 2023, where Dubois would face Jarrell Miller, the king of donuts. While Dubois was favoured to win the fight, Miller was still a real test for him, because if Dubois couldn't get rid of him in the first 5 rounds, Miller was insanely durable, had a ridiculous chin, and had ridiculous conditioning as well, for someone who's so big. So he'd be a real test for Dubois' conditioning and durability, and will to win in the second half of a fight, if the fight was to go on for that long. Once again, Dubois would face some adversity early on, but he took the punches well, he boxed well off the back foot, and eventually accumulated enough damage to produce a knockout in the final round of the fight, giving Miller the first loss of his professional career. So that was the second time that Dubois had to face some serious adversity early on in the fight, and then come back to win with a knockout. Dubois would then once again be thrown to the wolves against Filip Hrgović, the second time he'd be the betting underdog in a fight in his career, the first one being against Usyk. A fight in which that Dubois would eat a right hand over and over again, and 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 again. But the sheer pace of Dubois started to really wear on Hrgović, who started to eat massive right hands and slow down progressively more and more as the fight went on, eventually being cut open to the point where the referee had to step in and stop the fight. So that was the second undefeated opponent in a row that Dubois had stopped, and that set him up for the biggest fight of his career, headlining Wembley Stadium against Anthony Joshua. And we all know what happens next. So now Daniel Dubois does actually have a good case for being the #1 heavyweight in the world. Obviously on paper it is Usyk. Usyk has a win over Dubois, Usyk's former undisputed champion, but Dubois did just outperform Usyk in both of his Joshua fights in the space of 5 rounds, plus the body shot in their fight, and the fact that if Dubois and Usyk were to rematch, Usyk would be much older, and Dubois would be much improved and filled with confidence. So it would be a very dangerous fight for Usyk either way, regardless of the first fight. So in conclusion, not only has Dubois erased all the criticisms of him being a quitter, but he's also arguably the #1 heavyweight in the world, which is weird to say. Goodbye.